Imagine a threshold, not the simple wooden frame of a doorway, but something far more ancient and fundamental. A place where the familiar world you know, the world of reason and light, brushes against something older, something that watches from the corners where shadows gather and linger. This is where our story begins, at the edge of visibility, in the presence of a creature that has haunted human consciousness for thousands of years. The black cat, sleek, silent, and utterly unknowable. You have seen them, of course, moving like liquid darkness through alleyways, perched on windowsills with eyes that reflect light like twin moons, crossing your path with an indifference that feels almost deliberate. But what you see is only the surface. Beneath that elegant exterior lies a history so complex, so steeped in blood and reverence, that it transforms this simple animal into something far more significant. The black cat is not merely a pet or a pest. It is a symbol that has been worshipped as divine, condemned as demonic, and feared as the living bridge between our world and the one that exists just beyond the veil of perception. Before we journey deeper into this darkness, I want to invite you to join our community here at Echoes of the Old World. We explore the forgotten corners of history, the myths that shape civilizations, and the creatures that still whisper to us from the past. If you find yourself drawn to these ancient mysteries, subscribe now and become part of our growing family of truth seekers. Ring the bell so you never miss a journey into the shadows. Now, let me ask you something personal. Before we continue down this path together, leave a comment below and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Are you in a place where black cats are feared, or are you somewhere they are celebrated? I want to know your story, your connection to these mysterious creatures. Your perspective matters here. The relationship between humans and black cats is not a simple tale of superstition. It is a mirror, reflecting our deepest fears and highest aspirations across millennia. In ancient Egypt, these creatures walked as gods among mortals, protected by laws that made their murder a capital offense. They were Bastet incarnate, divine guardians whose presence in a home brought blessing and protection. Temples rose in their honor. Priests tended to their needs. When they died, they were mummified with the same care reserved for pharaohs, because to the Egyptians, they were not animals, but living manifestations of the sacred. Yet that same creature, revered in the land of the Nile, would become in medieval Europe the most feared and persecuted animal in history. The transformation was not gradual, it was deliberate, systematic, and devastating. As Christianity spread across the continent, the old gods were cast down, and everything associated with pagan worship became suspect. The black cat, with its nocturnal habits and independent, fit too perfectly into the new narrative of evil that the church was constructing. By the 13th century, papal decree had sealed their fate. They were no longer companions. They were familiars, demonic servants of Satan himself, and anyone who harbored them was complicit in witchcraft. Consider the cruel irony of this shift. The same qualities that made them sacred, their silence, their ability to move unseen, their luminous eyes that seemed to see beyond the visible world, now marked them for destruction. Thousands upon thousands were killed, burned alive in wicker cages, thrown from bell towers, hunted in organized purges that swept through villages and cities alike. The slaughter was justified by faith, sanctioned by authority, and carried out with the fervor of holy war. But this was not just an attack on animals. It was an assault on the old ways, on feminine power, on anything that existed outside the rigid control of institutional religion. What the persecutors could not foresee was the price their descendants would pay for this genocide. With the cats gone, rat populations exploded. The rodents multiplied in streets, homes, and granaries, their numbers unchecked by natural predators. And when the ships arrived from the east, carrying fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, those rats became the perfect vectors for transmission. The Black Death, that apocalyptic plague that killed 1/3 of Europe's population, was not an act of God. It was the consequence of superstition, the harvest of fear sown by those who saw demons in the eyes of innocent creatures. Yet the story does not end in darkness. Across the world, in Japan and Scotland, in parts of England and throughout the East, black cats retained their status as bringers of good fortune. The same animal that Europeans burned was welcomed into Japanese homes as a guardian against evil spirits. The Maneki-neko, the beckoning cat, became a symbol of prosperity. Scottish sailors considered them essential crew members, believing their presence ensured safe passage. The divergence reveals something profound about human. We do not see the world as it is. We see it as we are, projecting our fears and hopes onto creatures who simply exist, independent of our interpretations. Tonight, as Halloween approaches and black cats once again become symbols of the season, it is worth remembering that their curse was never their own. They did not change. We did. From gods to demons to internet celebrities, these creatures have remained constant while human perception swings like a pendulum between reverence and revulsion. The shadow at the threshold is not cast by them. It is cast by us, by our capacity for both wisdom and madness, by our ability to see the divine and the demonic in the same innocent creature. This is the story we will tell together, a story of worship and persecution, of ecological disaster born from religious fervor, of superstitions that still influence us today. Join me as we trace the path of the black cat through history, following its shadow from ancient temples to medieval pyres, from Asian shrines to modern animal shelters. The journey will be dark, but necessary, because only by understanding how we created this curse can we hope to finally break it. Travel back with me now to a time when the Nile flowed through a civilization that understood something we have forgotten. A time when divinity was not distant, not locked away in heaven, but walked among the living on 4 silent paws. Ancient Egypt, greatest of the early empires, saw in the black cat what we would spend millennia trying to destroy. They saw the sacred, they saw the divine made flesh, and they built an entire culture of reverence around these creatures that would make our modern relationship with them seem barbaric by comparison. Picture the city of Bubastis, located in the Nile Delta, its temples rising white against the desert sky. This was the center of cat worship, the heart of devotion to Bastet, the feline goddess who embodied protection, fertility, and the fierce maternal love that defends the young. But Bastet was not merely represented by cats. She was believed to inhabit them, to look through their eyes, to move through the world in their elegant forms. Every cat, particularly those with dark fur, was a potential vessel for the goddess herself. To harm one was not simply cruelty to an animal, it was an assault on the divine, a crime punishable by death without trial or appeal. The laws protecting cats in ancient Egypt were not symbolic gestures. They were absolute and brutally enforced. Historical accounts record instances where Roman soldiers accidentally killed cats and were torn apart by enraged mobs before authorities could intervene. Egyptian families, who lost their cats to natural causes, would shave their eyebrows in mourning, a gesture reserved for the death of close family members. The grief was genuine, profound, and publicly displayed. These were not pets, in the way we understand the term. They were sacred guardians, members of the household who bridged the gap between mortal existence and divine protection. Consider what this meant in practical terms for the cats themselves. They lived in luxury unknown to most humans of that era. Temples maintained dedicated staffs to care for them, ensuring they were fed the finest fish, given cream and milk, adorned with jeweled collars and golden earrings. Priestesses tended to their needs, interpreting their movements and behaviors as messages from Bastet herself. When they purred, it was the goddess expressing pleasure. When they hissed or retreated, it was a warning that something displeased the divine. Every aspect of their behavior was observed, recorded, and treated as communication from the realm beyond mortal understanding. But the true measure of their status becomes clear when we examine what happened after death. Cat mummification was not a rare practice reserved for a few special animals. It was performed on a scale that staggers the modern imagination. Archaeological excavations have uncovered cat cemeteries containing hundreds of thousands of mummified remains, each one carefully prepared with the same techniques used for human nobility. Their bodies were wrapped in fine linen, placed in bronze or wooden sarcophagi, decorated with intricate carvings, and interred in sacred necropolises where priests performed regular offerings and rituals. Some were buried with mummified mice, ensuring they would not go hungry in the afterlife. This was not superstition. This was theology made manifest, belief system given physical form. The black cat held particular significance within this hierarchy of the sacred. Its dark fur was associated with the fertile black soil left by the Nile's annual floods, the rich earth that made Egypt's agricultural dominance possible. Black was not the color of evil or misfortune in Egyptian thought. It was the color of life itself, of regeneration, of the mysterious process by which death becomes birth. A black cat in your home was considered the highest blessing Bastet could bestow, a sign that your family was under direct divine protection. Households competed for the privilege of hosting these creatures, offering them the best sleeping places, the finest foods, treating them as honored guests who had chosen to grace the home with their presence. The relationship extended beyond the domestic sphere into matters of state and military. Cats accompanied Egyptian armies on campaign, their presence believed to ensure victory and protect soldiers from harm. There are accounts of battles where Egyptian forces were defeated, not through superior tactics, but through psychological warfare involving cats. Enemy commanders, knowing the Egyptians' reverence, would tie cats to their shields or release them onto the battlefield, forcing Egyptian soldiers to choose between military objectives and risking harm to sacred animals. More often than not, the Egyptians would retreat or surrender rather than risk injuring creatures they believed were divine. This level of reverence also created a lucrative black market. As Egypt's power and influence spread, other civilizations became aware of the value Egyptians placed on cats. Smuggling them out of Egypt became a serious crime, punishable by death, yet it happened with increasing frequency. Foreign traders would risk execution to acquire breeding pairs, knowing they could command extraordinary prices in markets from Greece to Persia. The Egyptian authorities fought this trade with religious fervor, conducting raids on ports and border crossings, executing smugglers publicly as warnings. But the demand was insatiable, and slowly, despite their best efforts, cats began to spread across the ancient world, carrying with them the seeds of both worship and future persecution. What Egypt understood, and what we have spent millennia forgetting, is that reverence for other living beings is not primitive superstition. It is recognition of the sacred of life itself. an acknowledgement that consciousness exists in forms beyond our own, deserving of respect and protection. The Egyptians did not see cats as tools or commodities. They saw them as partners in existence, creatures whose presence made life more complete, more connected to the divine order that governed all things. When a cat chose your home, you had been chosen by the goddess. When it purred in your lap, you were receiving a blessing. When it died, you mourned as you would mourn family, because in the truest sense, that is what it was. This golden age of feline reverence would not last. As Egypt's power waned and new religions spread across the Mediterranean, the cat's status would begin its long, tragic decline. But for nearly 3,000 years, along the banks of the Nile, these creatures lived as gods. And in their treatment, we see reflected the best of what humanity can be when we choose reverence over fear, when we see the sacred in the everyday, when we understand that divinity does not require distance, but can walk beside us, silent and beautiful, on 4 dark paws. There are moments in history when the world pivots on a single decision, when one man's words reshape the fate of millions. The year 1233 marks such a moment, though you would not have known it if you were living through it. In Rome, within the Vatican's sacred halls, Pope Gregory IX sat down to compose a document that would transform beloved companions into creatures of terror. The papal bull Vox in Rama, issued on the 13th of June, was not merely a religious decree. It was a death sentence, written in Latin and sealed with divine authority, condemning cats to centuries of persecution that would cost millions of human lives in ways the Pope could never have imagined. But to understand how this happened, we must first understand the world Gregory inherited. Christianity had been spreading across Europe for over 1,000 years, absorbing and suppressing pagan traditions wherever it took root. The old gods were cast down, their temples destroyed or converted, their followers forced to choose between conversion and death. Yet paganism was resilient, surviving in folk practices, seasonal celebrations, and in the reverence people maintained for certain animals. Cats, with their independence and nocturnal habits, had retained some of the mystique they carried from ancient times. Country folk still welcomed them for their practical value as pest controllers, and some, particularly older women living alone, kept them as companions. This connection between cats and those who lived on the margins of Christian society would prove fatal for both. Gregory's bull did not arrive in a vacuum. It emerged from a growing paranoia within the Church about heretical movements that threatened its absolute authority. Groups like the Cathars and the Waldensians were gaining followers, offering alternative interpretations of Christianity that challenged Rome's monopoly on salvation. The Church needed a strategy to discredit these movements, to make them so repugnant to the faithful that no decent person would consider joining them. The solution was elegant in its cruelty: associate heretics with the most forbidden crime imaginable, the worship of Satan himself. And what better symbol of satanic allegiance than the cat? That creature of darkness and mystery that seemed to move between worlds. Vox in Rama described in explicit detail the supposed rituals of heretical sects. According to the document, initiates would gather in secret, and a black cat would descend among them, sometimes the size of a dog, sometimes larger. The worshippers would kiss this creature first on its paws, then beneath its tail, then on its mouth, receiving from it the power to deny Christ and pledge allegiance to Lucifer. The cat was not merely present at these rituals, it was, according to Gregory, a manifestation of Satan himself, choosing this form to move among his followers and receive their devotion. The imagery was deliberately revolting, designed to shock faithful Christians and justify any measures taken against those who kept such creatures. What makes this document particularly insidious is its timing and its target. Gregory was not describing actual practices he had witnessed or investigated. He was codifying rumors, gossip, and the confessions extracted under torture from accused heretics. The bull presented speculation as established fact, giving church authorities across Europe the theological justification they needed to begin what would become one of history's most systematic campaigns of animal genocide. Within years of its publication, cats were being killed by the thousands. Methods varied by region, but the enthusiasm for their destruction was universal. They were burned alive in wicker cages during religious festivals, thrown from church towers, hunted in organized purges that swept through towns and villages. The transformation in how cats were perceived happened with shocking speed. Animals that had been valued members of households became evidence of heresy. Women who kept cats, particularly those who lived alone or practiced traditional healing with herbs, found themselves under suspicion. The logic was circular and inescapable. Heretics kept cats as familiars. Therefore, anyone with a cat might be a heretic. Therefore, the presence of cats justified investigation, torture, and execution. The Inquisition built cases on this foundation of superstition, and thousands died because they had shown kindness to creatures the Church had decided were demonic. Yet even as official church doctrine condemned cats, the reality on the ground was more complex. Monasteries, despite their allegiance to Rome, often kept cats to protect their grain stores and libraries from rodents. Sailors, regardless of religious belief, considered cats essential crew members, their presence believed to ensure safe voyages. The disconnect between theological condemnation and practical necessity created a strange tension in medieval society. People needed cats, but were taught to fear them. They valued their services, but were told their presence invited damnation. This cognitive dissonance would persist for centuries, creating a relationship with cats that was simultaneously dependent and hostile. The impact of Gregory's decree extended far beyond the animals themselves. By linking cats to witchcraft and heresy, the Church created a framework that would eventually be turned against human beings, particularly women, the same qualities that made cats suspect. Independence, nocturnal activity, mysterious behavior were qualities the Church associated with women who refused to conform to acceptable roles. Widows, midwives, herbalists, any woman who lived outside male authority became vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. And inevitably, during investigations, authorities would ask about cats. Did the accused own one? Had neighbors seen her speaking to it? Did it appear when she called? The presence of a cat, particularly a black cat, became evidence as damning as any signed confession. What Gregory could not have foreseen was the ecological catastrophe his decree would help unleash. As cat populations crashed across Europe, rat populations exploded. Without natural predators to keep their numbers in check, rodents multiplied in streets, homes, granaries, and ships. They became so numerous that their presence was simply accepted as part of urban life, an unavoidable nuisance that no one connected to the absence of the creatures that had once kept them controlled. When the plague ships arrived from the east in 1347, carrying fleas infected with the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, those unchecked rat populations became the perfect vectors for transmission. The Black Death that followed killed between 75 and 200 million people, roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's total population. It was the deadliest pandemic in human history, and while its ultimate cause was a bacterium, the conditions that allowed it to spread so catastrophically were created, in part, by a pope who saw demons in the eyes of innocent animals. The shadow that Gregory cast was long and dark. His bull remained church doctrine for centuries, providing theological justification for the persecution that would only intensify during the witch trials of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. Millions of cats died. Tens of thousands of humans, mostly women, died alongside them. All because one man, armed with absolute religious authority, decided that a creature's nocturnal habits and independence made it an agent of evil. The lesson here is profound and terrifying. When power combines with superstition and absolute certainty, the results are catastrophic. Gregory believed he was protecting Christendom. Instead, he helped create the conditions for one of history's greatest disasters and inaugurated an era of persecution that would stain both church and society for centuries to come. Tipo, capitulu, numero. 4. Titulu. The familiar, a witch's dark companion. Contenido. Enter the world of the medieval witch trial, where logic becomes nightmare and innocence offers no protection. In these proceedings, documented in meticulous detail by court scribes across Europe, a new category of evidence emerged that would seal the fate of thousands. The familiar, not merely a pet or companion, but something far more sinister in the eyes of the Inquisition, a demon given physical form, a gift from Satan himself to those who had sworn allegiance to darkness, and the most common manifestation of this demonic servant, a black cat, sleek and silent, moving through the shadows at its mistress's command. To understand the concept of the familiar, you must first grasp the theology that created it. Medieval Christianity taught that Satan, though cast from heaven, retained certain powers in the earthly realm. He could not create life, for that was God's domain alone, but he could inhabit existing creatures, bending them to his will and using them as intermediaries with his human followers. According to demonologists and witch hunters, when a person made a pact with the devil, signing their name in his book and pledging their soul, they received in return a familiar spirit. This entity would appear as an animal, most often a cat, and would serve as advisor, protector, and accomplice in the practice of maleficent magic. The Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous witch hunting manual, published in 1486, devoted extensive passages to identifying and understanding familiars. The text, written by Dominican inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, became the definitive guide for witch hunters across Catholic Europe. It described how familiars would suckle from their witches through special teats, invisible protuberances on the body that marked the witch's covenant with Satan. Investigators would search accused women for these marks, any mole, birthmark, or skin irregularity becoming proof of guilt. The familiar. There exists in the darkest corners of medieval belief a terror more profound than demonic possession or satanic pacts. It is the fear of transformation, the horror that the human form itself is unstable, that beneath the skin of your neighbor or the widow who lives alone at the edge of town lurks something fundamentally other. According to witch hunters and inquisitors across Europe, witches possessed the most frightening power imaginable. They could shed their human form like a cloak and become the very creatures they commanded. They could become black cats, slipping through locked doors, prowling through darkness, witnessing secrets and working malevolence while their human bodies lay safely in bed, beyond suspicion and accusation. This belief in transformation, in shape-shifting, was not considered metaphorical by those who prosecuted witches. It was understood as literal, physical metamorphosis, documented in trial records with the same matter-of-fact language used to record property disputes or debt collections. Witnesses would testify under oath that they had seen a woman transform before their eyes, her body contracting and sprouting fur, her face elongating into a feline muzzle, her fingers curling into claws. Others reported watching cats behave with suspicious intelligence, following specific people, appearing at windows at meaningful moments, demonstrating knowledge that no ordinary animal could possess. In the logic of witch prosecution, these observations were not delusions or misinterpretations. They were evidence of the supernatural abilities granted to those who had forsworn Christ and embraced darkness. The most compelling proof of transformation came from what witch hunters called sympathetic wounds, injuries that appeared simultaneously on both the animal and human form. Trial records from Scotland, England, France, and Germany contain dozens of accounts following the same pattern. A black cat would be discovered in a barn or home where it had no business being. Suspicious residents would attack it, driving it away with sticks or knives, sometimes inflicting serious injuries. The next morning, a local woman, usually one already under suspicion for witchcraft, would appear with wounds in exactly the same locations where the cat had been struck. A gash on the cat's left flank would manifest as an identical wound on the woman's side. A blow to the creature's head would produce a matching bruise on the accused witch's temple. To modern minds, these correlations seem absurd, easily explained by coincidence or deliberate fraud. To medieval prosecutors, they were irrefutable proof of transformation. Consider the case documented in Scotland during 1590, a trial that exemplifies how this belief operated in practice. A black cat was discovered in a merchant's cellar, behaving, according to witnesses, with unnatural boldness. When confronted, it did not flee, but stood its ground, staring at the intruders with what they described as human intelligence. The merchant's son struck it multiple times with a fireplace poker, driving it from the house. The cat escaped, but not before sustaining a severe injury to its right foreleg. The following day, an elderly woman named Isabel Gowdy, known in the community for her herbal knowledge and her habit of living alone, appeared in the town market with her right arm bound in cloth. When questioned about the injury, she claimed to have fallen, but neighbors noted the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Isabel was arrested, interrogated under torture, and eventually confessed to being a witch who transformed into a cat to spy on her neighbors and work malevolent magic. She was executed. Her confession entered into official records as documented fact, another data point in the growing body of evidence that witches could and did assume animal forms. The theological justification for transformation rested on the belief that Satan, though unable to create life, could manipulate existing matter. Demonologists argued that the devil could compress and reshape the witch's body, folding her human form into the smaller frame of a cat, then reversing the process when she wished to resume human shape. Some theorists proposed that the witch's actual body remained in trance, while her soul inhabited the cat, creating a link so strong that injuries to one manifested in the other. Others suggested a more complex arrangement where the witch and familiar shared consciousness, becoming temporarily merged into a single entity. The details varied, but the conclusion was always the same. Black cats were not merely animals, they were potential witches, and every witch was a potential cat. This belief transformed how people interacted with cats in their daily lives. A black cat crossing your path was no longer simply an animal going about its business. It was potentially a neighbor in disguise, watching you, gathering information, preparing to work harm against you or your family. Farmers who found cats in their barns faced an impossible dilemma. Kill it and risk injuring a witch who would then know your identity and seek revenge. Ignore it and allow the surveillance to continue. The paranoia this created was pervasive and corrosive, turning communities against themselves as people watched each other for signs of unusual injuries or suspicious absences. that might correlate with animal sightings. The evidence threshold for proving transformation was remarkably low, requiring only coincidence of timing and imagination willing to make connections. A woman arguing with a neighbor one day and a cat hissing at that same neighbor the next became proof of transformation. A widow whose cat was unusually affectionate and obedient was obviously commanding her familiar. An elderly woman who muttered to herself while her cat sat nearby was clearly conversing with her demonic companion, discussing plans and plotting revenge. Once suspicion took root, every action, every word, every observed interaction with cats became evidence of guilt. What makes this belief system particularly tragic is how it weaponized compassion. Women who showed kindness to cats, who fed strays or provided shelter to abandoned animals, marked themselves as suspicious. In a society where women had few sources of companionship or power, where widows and unmarried women were particularly vulnerable and isolated, cats offered unconditional acceptance and practical assistance in controlling vermin. But this relationship, which should have been recognized as simple human kindness toward other living creatures, was reinterpreted through the lens of demonology as proof of supernatural alliance. The very qualities that made someone likely to care for cats, independence, non-conformity, comfort with solitude, were the same qualities that made them vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. The shape-shifting myth created a world where no black cat was safe and no woman who associated with them could feel secure. It transformed every feline encounter into potential evidence, every scratch or bite into possible proof of identity, every wound on a woman's body into grounds for investigation. The boundaries between human and animal, between natural and supernatural, between innocent and guilty, collapsed into paranoid uncertainty, where anything could mean everything, and the only safety lay in avoiding cats entirely. For those who could not or would not abandon these creatures, the price was often their lives, burned or hanged based on the coincidence of injuries, the testimony of frightened neighbors, and a belief system that saw demons lurking behind every pair of luminous eyes watching from the darkness. Step now into the courtroom, that place where justice should reign, but where, during the witch trials, reason went to die. These were not courts in any sense we would recognize today. They were theaters of predetermined guilt, where the accused entered already condemned, where the only question was not whether you were a witch, but how much you would suffer before admitting it. And in these nightmarish proceedings, preserved in meticulous court records that still exist in archives across Europe and America, the presence of a black cat was evidence as damning as any signed confession in blood. Let us examine specific cases, real trials of real people whose lives ended because they showed kindness to creatures the court had decided were demonic. Scotland, 1563. The trial of Agnes Waterhouse, recorded in detail in the Chelmsford trials, stands as one of the earliest documented cases where a cat served as primary evidence of witchcraft. Agnes, a poor woman in her 60s, kept a white-spotted cat she called Satan, a name that would seal her fate. According to testimony, Agnes had received this cat from another woman accused of witchcraft, who taught her to feed it with drops of her own blood and bread soaked in milk. In exchange, the cat would perform tasks for her, spoiling neighbors' butter, causing livestock to sicken, even killing a man who had refused Agnes' charity. The prosecution presented the cat itself as evidence, bringing the creature into court, where its behavior, described as unusually calm and unafraid, was interpreted as proof of its demonic. Agnes, subjected to interrogation and facing execution, eventually confessed to everything. She admitted to 20 years of witchcraft, to transforming the cat into a toad, to instructing it to kill. She was hanged, the first woman executed for witchcraft in England, her cat destroyed alongside her. Move forward 30 years to Scotland, where the North Berwick witch trials of 1590 demonstrate how cat evidence could be weaponized for political purposes. King James VI, later James I of England, became personally involved in prosecuting a conspiracy he believed threatened his life. Among the accused was a schoolmaster named John Fian, tortured so severely that he confessed to leading 300 witches in a plot to assassinate the king. Part of the evidence against Fian involved cats. Witnesses testified that witches had christened cats, tied dismembered body parts to them, and thrown them into the sea to raise storms that would sink the king's ship. The logic was medieval and magical. The cat, serving as vessel for dark rituals, meant to manipulate itself. Fian was subjected to extreme torture. His fingernails pulled out, his legs crushed in iron boots, before being strangled and burned. The cats mentioned in testimony were destroyed, their ownership or association with the accused treated as proof of participation in treasonous witchcraft. But perhaps no case demonstrates the deadly absurdity of cat evidence better than the trial of Isabel Gowdie in Scotland, 1662. Gowdie provided what scholars consider the most detailed witch confession in Scottish records, describing in explicit terms how she and her coven would transform into cats to enter homes unseen. She named the specific enchantment used for transformation, described meeting the devil himself, detailed sexual encounters with demons, and listed numerous acts of malevolent magic. What makes her case remarkable is that no one had accused her. She confessed voluntarily, possibly suffering from mental illness or seeking attention in a life otherwise devoid of significance. Yet her confession, particularly its detailed descriptions of cat transformation, was accepted without question and entered into official records. While her ultimate fate is unclear, her testimony influenced witch trials across Scotland for decades, providing prosecutors with a template of what witch behaviour looked like, with cats featured prominently in the narrative. Cross the Atlantic now to Salem, Massachusetts, 1692, where the most famous American witch trials demonstrated that the terror was not confined to Europe. Among the accused was a woman named Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who wandered the roads with her young daughter. Good owned no property and possessed nothing except a pipe she smoked and the clothes on her back. Yet during her trial, witnesses testified to seeing her in the company of a yellow cat, later described in some accounts as appearing black in certain light. This cat, they claimed, was her familiar, sent to torment and bewitch the girls whose fits had triggered the hysteria. Other witnesses described seeing unusual animals near the homes of the accused, spectral cats that vanished when approached, interpreted as familiars sent on missions of harm. Sarah Good, pregnant at the time of her arrest, gave birth in prison to a daughter who died from the conditions. Sarah herself was hanged in July, protesting her innocence to the end, condemned in part because people had seen her near cats. The pattern across all these trials is consistent and chilling. The cat does not need to do anything overtly suspicious. Its mere presence, its association with the accused, becomes evidence. In some trials, the cat's behavior is analyzed and reinterpreted through the lens of demonology. If it seems unusually tame, this proves it is a familiar accustomed to human instruction. If it appears wild and aggressive, this demonstrates it's demonic. If it watches the proceedings calmly, it is clearly an intelligence observing events. If it struggles and fights, it is revealing its true evil. There is no behavior, no action, or inaction that cannot be twisted into proof of guilt. Consider the practical mechanics of how cat evidence functioned in court. Prosecutors would call witnesses who testified to seeing the accused with cats speaking to cats, or exhibiting behavior suggesting familiarity with specific animals. The accused, under interrogation, would be asked direct questions. Do you own a cat? Has a strange cat appeared at your door? Have you fed cats that do not belong to you? Have neighbors seen you with cats? Each affirmative answer became another thread in the rope that would eventually hang them. And negative answers were often disbelieved, with prosecutors suggesting the accused was lying to conceal her familiar, a lie that itself proved consciousness of guilt. The standards of evidence were impossibly broad and selectively applied. A wealthy woman with cats might be eccentric but respectable. A poor woman, especially one who had argued with neighbors or practiced traditional healing, became a witch. The same animal, in different contexts, carried entirely different meanings, its significance determined not by its, but by the social standing of its human companion. This double standard revealed the truth underlying the prosecutions. They were not really about cats at all. They were about controlling women, particularly women who existed outside patriarchal structures, women who were poor, old, unmarried, widowed, or simply difficult. The cats were props in a larger drama of social control, but they paid with their lives alongside their human companions. What makes these trials particularly tragic is their permanence in the historical record. We have the names, the dates, the transcripts of testimony. We can read the exact words used to condemn innocent people, can trace the logical fallacies and supernatural assumptions that passed for evidence. Agnes Waterhouse, John Fian, Isabel Gowdy, Sarah Good. These were real people with real lives, real families, real dreams and fears. They died because courts accepted as fact the belief that cats were demons, that women who kept them were witches, that testimony extracted under torture or given by frightened children constituted proof beyond doubt. Their deaths were legal, sanctioned by authority, carried out with official ceremony. And the cats died with them, destroyed as evidence, as accomplices, as creatures too dangerous to allow to live. This is what happens when superstition gains the force of law, when fear becomes policy, when courts abandon reason for hysteria. Justice becomes impossible, and innocence offers no protection at all. Picture Europe in the 13th century, a continent gripped by religious fervor and paranoid certainty. From the Iberian Peninsula to the Baltic Sea, from the British Isles to the borders of the Holy Roman Empire, a campaign of extermination was underway that would dwarf any pest control effort in history. This was not scattered violence or isolated incidents of cruelty. It was systematic, organized, and sanctioned by the highest authorities in Christendom. The target was not an invading army or a plague of locusts. It was the black cat, and by extension, all cats that shared their nocturnal habits and independent. What followed was genocide on a scale difficult for modern minds to comprehend, a war against animals that would reshape the ecology of an entire continent and set the stage for catastrophe. The methods of killing varied by region, but certain practices became standard across Catholic Europe. In France, particularly in Paris and the provinces of Burgundy and Champagne, cats were collected by the hundreds and burned alive in wicker cages during religious festivals. The Feast of St. John became particularly associated with this practice. Enormous pyres would be constructed in town squares, and as darkness fell, cages full of cats would be hoisted above the flames. Their screams as they burned were interpreted as demons being cast out, their deaths a cleansing ritual that protected the community from evil. Kings and nobles would attend these events, sometimes lighting the fires themselves as demonstrations of piety. The spectacle drew crowds who watched the animals die while priests blessed the proceedings and choirs sang hymns of praise. In parts of Germany and the Low Countries, a different tradition emerged that was no less cruel. Cats would be collected and thrown from the tops of church bell towers during Lent, their bodies shattering on the cobblestones below while crowds gathered to watch. The practice, known as kattenstoot in Flemish regions, was believed to drive evil spirits from the town and ensure good harvests. In some areas, the tradition became competitive, with young men vying to see who could throw cats the farthest or cause the most dramatic deaths. The churches that hosted these events were not obscure rural chapels, but major cathedrals in prosperous cities. The killing happened in broad daylight, sanctioned by civic and religious authorities, attended by respectable citizens who saw nothing wrong with the spectacle. Britain developed its own variations on feline persecution. In England and Scotland, cats were sealed alive into the walls of buildings during construction, a practice meant to bring good luck or ward off evil spirits. Archaeological excavations of medieval structures have uncovered hundreds of cat skeletons entombed in walls, chimneys, and foundations, their final moments unimaginable as they suffocated or starved in complete darkness. Other cats were hunted in organized drives, particularly in rural areas where they had fled to escape urban persecution. Entire villages would turn out with dogs and weapons, sweeping through forests and fields, killing any cat they encountered. The hunters were sometimes paid bounties for tails or pelts, creating economic incentive for thoroughness in the extermination. The scale of the killing is difficult to calculate precisely, but fragmentary records and archaeological evidence suggest it was massive. In Paris alone, during the height of the persecution in the 14th and 15th centuries, thousands of cats were killed annually in organized burnings and hunts. Multiply this across hundreds of cities and thousands of villages across Catholic Europe, sustained over centuries, and the death toll reaches into the millions. Entire populations of urban and rural cats were wiped out. In some regions, cats became so rare that spotting one was considered remarkable, worth recording in journals and chronicles. The species did not go extinct because some populations survived in remote areas, on ships, and in the protection of monasteries that quietly ignored church doctrine for practical reasons. But the European cat population crashed to levels not seen since before their initial domestication. What makes this genocide particularly striking is its public and the enthusiasm with which ordinary people participated. These were not secret killings carried out by specialists or authorities. They were community events, festivals, celebrations where the whole town would gather to watch animals die. Parents brought children to teach them about the dangers of Satan and the importance of vigilance against evil. Young couples attended as entertainment, a social occasion like any other festival. The normalization of this cruelty, the complete absence of empathy or recognition that the creatures being tortured were capable of suffering, reveals something dark about human when religious certainty overrides compassion. The Church's role in this campaign cannot be overstated. While individual priests might have privately questioned the practice, official doctrine consistently supported and encouraged the persecution. Sermons preached the dangers of cats, their association with witchcraft, they're as vessels for demons. Papal bulls and ecclesiastical decrees provided theological justification. Inquisitors wrote manuals detailing how to identify familiar spirits and instructing authorities to destroy any cats found in the possession of accused witches. The institutional power of the Church, its control over education and moral authority, its ability to define sin and righteousness, made resistance to the persecution almost impossible. To question the killing of cats was to question the Church itself, a dangerous position that could easily lead to accusations of heresy. Yet even as the official campaign raged, contradictions persisted. Monasteries, as mentioned, often kept cats despite church doctrine. valuing them too highly as protectors of grain stores and precious manuscripts to follow official policy. Sailors universally ignored the persecution, considering cats essential for controlling rats on long voyages and believing their presence ensured safe passage. Some nobility, particularly those involved in agriculture, quietly maintained cat populations on their estates, recognizing their practical value even while publicly supporting anti-cat rhetoric. These exceptions reveal that people knew cats were useful, that their presence served important functions. But institutional pressure and social conformity overwhelmed practical considerations, forcing the persecution forward even when its consequences were becoming apparent. The ecological impact of removing millions of predators from the environment was immediate and devastating. Without cats to control their populations, rodents multiplied exponentially. Rats, in particular, flourished in the new reality, their numbers growing unchecked in cities, towns, villages, and farms. They infested grain stores, contaminating food supplies and causing economic damage. They invaded homes, spreading disease and creating unsanitary conditions. They bred in sewers and waste dumps, their populations reaching levels that would have been impossible with functioning predator populations. The medieval world became a paradise for rats, a reality that would soon transform into nightmare when ships from the east arrived, carrying fleas, infected with a bacterium that would kill tens of millions. The cat genocide represents one of history's clearest examples of how superstition, when combined with institutional power and social pressure, can override reason, compassion, and practical necessity. Millions of animals died horrible deaths because humans decided they were evil. The decision was based not on evidence or reason, but on theological speculation, rumors, and the need for scapegoats to explain misfortune. And the humans who made this decision, who carried it out with such enthusiasm, could not imagine that they were creating the conditions for their own destruction, that the absence of these predators would allow disease vectors to multiply until plague swept across the continent like divine judgment. The irony is almost biblical. In trying to protect themselves from imagined spiritual danger, they created actual physical catastrophe. In killing creatures they believed were demonic, they opened the door for genuine apocalypse. There is a principle in ecology that medieval Europeans did not understand, a truth about the interconnectedness of all living things that would cost them dearly. Remove a predator from an ecosystem and you do not simply create an absence. You create opportunity. You unleash the prey species from the only check on their population that evolution designed. And when that prey species is as adaptable, prolific, and disease-carrying as the common rat, the consequences are not merely inconvenient. They're catastrophic. As cats disappeared from European cities and countryside in the 13th and 14th centuries, systematically hunted and killed in the name of faith, something else was happening in the shadows, something that would not be fully understood until it was far too late. Watch a city transform in the absence of predators. Start with Paris, that great medieval capital where thousands of cats burned in annual festivals. In the years before the persecution intensified, rats were present but manageable, their populations controlled by both cats and human efforts at sanitation. But as the cat genocide progressed, residents began noticing changes. Rats appeared in greater numbers, moving more boldly through streets and alleys. They invaded grain stores that had previously been secure, contaminating food supplies and causing economic losses. They nested in the thatched roofs of homes, their scratching and squeaking audible at night. Within a generation, the rat population had exploded to levels that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. The city, like dozens of others across Europe, became a paradise for rodents. The rats that benefited most from feline absence were not the native field species, but the black rat, Rattus rattus, and later the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus. These species, originally from Asia, had been gradually spreading westward along trade routes for centuries. In regions with healthy cat populations, their expansion was slow, limited by predation and competition. But in the new reality of cat-depleted Europe, they found ideal conditions. Urban environments offered abundant food in the form of human waste and stored grain. Buildings provided shelter and nesting sites. And most crucially, the primary predator that had kept their ancestors in check for thousands of years was suddenly, dramatically absent. The rats, bred with extraordinary speed, each pair capable of producing dozens of offspring annually, those offspring breeding within months of birth, creating exponential population growth. Medieval people noticed the rat explosion, but failed to connect it to the cat genocide. The two events seemed unrelated in their minds, occurring in separate categories of existence. Cats were spiritual matters, questions of witchcraft and demonic influence, subjects for priests and inquisitors. Rats were practical problems, pests to be dealt with through traps, poison, and human hunting efforts. The idea that these phenomena were linked, that the absence of one enabled the proliferation of the other, did not occur to most people. Ecology as A did not exist. The concept of food chains and predator-prey relationships would not be formalized for centuries. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where they understood agriculture and animal husbandry, but failed to grasp the larger patterns governing animal populations and ecosystem balance. Some observers did notice the connection, though their insights were dismissed or ignored. Monastic chroniclers, watching rat populations surge while cat numbers crashed, occasionally recorded their suspicions that the two events might be related. A few scholars suggested that killing cats might be counterproductive, that their value as rat hunters outweighed concerns about witchcraft. But these voices were isolated and ineffective against the overwhelming tide of religious certainty. The persecution continued, driven by theological conviction and social pressure, even as the consequences became increasingly visible. Grain stores were devastated, food prices rose, disease began to spread with unusual frequency, and still, the killing of cats proceeded, justified by faith and sanctioned by authority. The rats themselves carried another invisible threat that medieval people could not perceive. Living in their fur were fleas, tiny parasites that fed on rodent blood and occasionally jumped to human hosts. Under normal circumstances, with rat populations controlled by predators, these fleas remained a minor nuisance. But as rat numbers exploded, so did flea populations, their numbers growing proportionally with their hosts. The medieval city became a tinderbox of biological potential. Millions of rats carrying millions of fleas, all living in close proximity to human populations. All that was needed was the spark, the introduction of the specific bacterium that would transform this ecological disaster into human apocalypse. Consider the magnitude of the population shift. Historical estimates suggest that in some European cities, the rat population may have increased tenfold or more following the intensive cat persecution. For every rat that had existed in 1200, there were now 10 or more in 1350. In London, Paris, Florence, Cologne, and dozens of other major cities, rats outnumbered humans by ratios that would shock modern pest control experts. The medieval world had become a rat world, with humans merely cohabiting space that rodents increasingly dominated. Sewers, which were primitive or non-existent in many cities, became rat highways. Marketplaces, where food was sold and often stored, became feeding grounds. Homes, with their wooden construction and limited defenses against small intruders, became nesting sites. The economic impact of the rat explosion was substantial, but diffused enough that people treated it as a series of unrelated problems rather than a systemic crisis. Merchants complained about contaminated grain. Bakers reported increased losses to rodent theft. Homeowners dealt with structural damage from rat gnawing. But these were seen as individual misfortunes, bad luck, or perhaps divine punishment for unrelated sins. The larger pattern, that an entire continent had severely damaged its own ecological balance and was now suffering the consequences, remained invisible to most observers. Medieval economics did not include concepts like ecosystem services or the value of natural pest control. They could not calculate what the absent cats had been worth because they had taken their services for granted until those services were gone. Historians looking back can trace the progression with painful clarity. The cat genocide intensified in the mid-13th century following Pope Gregory's bull. Rat populations began their dramatic rise in the late 1300s. By the early 1400s, European cities were reporting unprecedented rodent infestations. The stage was set, the conditions prepared, the biological tinderbox constructed through religious zealotry and ecological ignorance. All that remained was the arrival of ships from the east, carrying trade goods, spices, and in their holds, rats infected with fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. When those ships docked in European ports in 1347, they unleashed a catastrophe that the continent's own actions had made inevitable. The hunters were gone. The prey had multiplied beyond control, and humanity was about to pay a terrible price for its war against creatures it should have protected. October 1347. A fleet of merchant ships limps into the harbour of Messina, Sicily, arriving from the Black Sea port of Caffa. The crews are dying, their bodies covered in swellings the size of eggs, their skin blackening with necrotic tissue, their final hours marked by fever and delirium. Harbour officials, recognising the danger, order the ships expelled, but it is already too late. The rats in the holds have scurried ashore, carrying in their fur fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, a bacterium so lethal that it will kill between 75 and 200 million people over the next 7 years. This is the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in human history. And while its ultimate cause is biological, the conditions that allowed it to spread with such apocalyptic efficiency were created by humans who thought they were fighting evil by killing cats. Understand first what bubonic plague is and how it spreads. The bacterium lives in the digestive system of fleas, particularly the rat flea Xenocilla chiopis. When an infected flea bites a host, it regurgitates bacteria into the wound, transmitting the disease. Rats are the primary reservoir, maintaining the bacterium in their populations and providing mobile homes for the fleas. Under normal ecological conditions, plague exists in small, isolated pockets, limited by geography and by predators that keep rat populations in check. But medieval Europe in 1347 was not operating under normal ecological conditions. It was a continent where the primary predator of rats had been systematically exterminated for over a century, where rat populations had exploded to unprecedented levels, where cities were so infested with rodents that they outnumbered human residents. The plague spread with terrifying speed, moving along trade routes and waterways, carried by infected rats that travelled in cargo ships and merchant caravans. From Messina, it reached mainland Italy within months. By 1348, it had infected France, Spain, and the Balkans. By 1349, it had reached Germany, England, and Scandinavia. By 1350, no corner of Europe remained untouched. The progression was relentless and devastating. Cities that had bustled with commerce fell silent as half their populations died. Villages were abandoned entirely, their residents either dead or fled. Corpses piled in streets because there were not enough living to bury the dead. The scale of death was so immense that it defied comprehension for those living through it. Chroniclers of the time struggled to describe what they were witnessing. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence, described bodies lying in the streets like garbage, families abandoning their sick relatives out of fear, the complete breakdown of social order, as terror overwhelmed all other considerations. The Welsh poet Joan Gethin wrote of death coming into their midst like black smoke, of entire communities wiped out, of survivors wandering through empty villages, wondering if they were the last people alive. These were not hysterical exaggerations. Modern analysis of death records, property transfers, and tax rolls confirms the catastrophic impact. Some regions lost 70% of their population. Entire bloodlines ended. Professions that required years of training lost their masters, taking specialized knowledge to the grave. The connection to cats, to the genocide carried out in the name of faith, was not apparent to most people experiencing the plague. Medieval medicine did not understand germ theory or disease vectors. They attributed the plague to divine punishment, to poisoned air, to the malign influence of planetary alignments, to anything except the ecological disaster they had created themselves. A few observers noted that regions with larger cat populations seemed less severely affected, that monasteries that had quietly maintained cats lost fewer members than those that had strictly followed church doctrine. But these observations were dismissed as coincidence or ignored entirely. The dominant interpretation was theological. God was punishing humanity for its sins, and the appropriate response was increased piety, more fervent prayer, stricter adherence to church teachings. Yet, the irony is inescapable when viewed from historical distance. The church that had ordered the cat genocide, that had provided theological justification for killing millions of animals, found its own authority severely damaged by the plague. People began questioning how an institution that claimed to speak for God could not prevent or explain such catastrophic suffering. Some turned to extreme religious movements, flagellants who whipped themselves bloody in public processions, believing physical punishment could appease divine wrath. Others abandoned faith entirely, deciding that a God who would allow such horror was not worthy of worship. The Black Death did not merely kill individuals, it killed the absolute certainty of medieval Christianity, opening cracks in institutional authority that would eventually widen into the Reformation. The economic consequences reshaped European society in ways that persisted for centuries. With so many dead, labor became scarce and valuable. Peasants who had lived in near slavery could suddenly demand wages and better treatment. The rigid feudal system began to break down as survivors realized they had leverage. Land that had been worth fortunes became worthless because there was no one to work it. Entire estates passed to distant relatives or were abandoned. The plague killed indiscriminately, taking nobles and peasants, clergy and merchants, young and old. It erased the medieval assumption that social hierarchy reflected divine will, because clearly God was not protecting those who claimed to speak for him. Consider the counterfactual. If Europe had maintained healthy cat populations, if the church had not declared war on creatures whose only crime was being associated with pagan traditions, would the plague still have come? Almost certainly. The bacterium existed. The trade routes were active. Infected rats would have arrived regardless. But would it have spread so catastrophically? Historical analysis suggests not. With functional predator populations keeping rats in check, the disease would have had fewer vectors, would have spread more slowly, would have affected fewer people. The death toll might have been in the hundreds of thousands, rather than millions. Cities with better ecological balance might have weathered the storm with manageable losses rather than apocalyptic devastation. The Black Death stands as one of history's clearest demonstrations that actions have consequences, that ecological systems cannot be disrupted without cost, that superstition and certainty are dangerous when they override reason and observation. Medieval Europeans didn't intend to create conditions perfect for plague. They thought they were protecting themselves from demons and witches. They believed they were following God's will. They were certain they were right. And their certainty, combined with institutional power and religious authority, created catastrophe on a scale that dwarfed anything the witches they feared could have accomplished. The cats they killed could not have cursed them more effectively than they cursed themselves through ignorance and zealotry. Walk down any street in Britain today and mention that a black cat crossed your path, and you will receive conflicting reactions. Some will smile, considering it good fortune. Others will grimace, seeing it as an omen of misfortune to come. This contradiction, this fundamental disagreement about whether black cats bring luck or disaster, reveals something fascinating about how superstitions evolve, spread, and mutate across time and geography. The British relationship with black cats is particularly complex, shaped by centuries of witch persecution, regional variations, and the gradual transformation of terror into tradition. To understand why a simple animal crossing your path became weighted with such significance, we must trace this belief back through the blood-soaked centuries of the witch trials and beyond. The superstition, in its most familiar form, states that if a black cat crosses your path, you should expect bad luck, possibly even death. This belief took root during the height of witch persecution, when cats were understood not as animals, but as familiars, demonic spirits serving witches and carrying out their malevolent will. A cat crossing your path was not a random encounter. It was interpreted as a deliberate act, a witch's familiar marking you for attention, observing you for future harm, or actively working a curse against you. The cat's trajectory mattered enormously in some versions. If it crossed from left to right, the omen was supposedly worse than right to left. If it stopped and stared at you, this was particularly ominous, suggesting the familiar was studying you specifically, perhaps reporting back to its mistress about your vulnerabilities. The origins of this specific belief are difficult to trace precisely, but evidence suggests it crystallized during the 16th and 17th centuries, the peak era of British witch trials. Court records from this period show that encounters with black cats were frequently cited in witch accusations. A woman would argue with a neighbor, and shortly afterward, that neighbor would see a black cat cross their path. Within days, some misfortune would occur. A cow would die, a child would fall ill, crops would fail, and the sequence of events would be interpreted as witchcraft. The initial argument established motive. The cat crossing the path demonstrated method. The subsequent misfortune proved guilt. The logic was circular but compelling to people living in fear of invisible forces and desperate to understand why bad things happened to them. Consider how this superstition functioned as social control. If you believed that a black cat crossing your path brought bad luck, you became hyper-aware of such encounters. You watched for cats, noted their movements, treated their presence as meaningful, and because you were watching for misfortune after such an encounter, you were primed to notice when anything went wrong. This is confirmation bias in action, a psychological tendency to notice evidence that supports our beliefs, while ignoring evidence that contradicts them. The superstition created its own proof, turning random encounters with animals and random instances of bad luck into a pattern that seemed to validate the original fear. But Britain, unlike the rest of Europe, developed regional variations that complicate the simple narrative of black cats as omens of doom. In some parts of England, particularly in the Yorkshire region, black cats were considered lucky, their presence in a home bringing prosperity and protection. Sailors' wives in fishing villages would keep black cats, believing they would ensure their husbands returned safely from sea. This tradition was strong enough that black cats were sometimes stolen from homes to serve on ships, despite the theft being punishable by law. The contradiction between black cats as demonic and black cats as protective existed simultaneously in different parts of the same country, demonstrating how superstitions are not universal truths, but localized beliefs shaped by culture, history, and community tradition. Scotland represents perhaps the strongest British exception to the black cat curse narrative. Scottish folklore overwhelmingly treats black cats as bringers of good fortune. A black cat appearing on your doorstep was considered a blessing, indicating that prosperity was coming to your household. A black cat at a wedding meant the marriage would be happy and prosperous. Even the manner of encounter that elsewhere signified doom, a black cat crossing your path, was interpreted positively in Scottish tradition, suggesting that you were about to receive unexpected good fortune or meet someone who would change your life for the better. This radical divergence from English belief likely stems from Scotland's more complex relationship with witchcraft prosecution and its retention of older Celtic traditions that viewed cats more favourably. The contradiction becomes even more pronounced when examining the theatre, that peculiarly British institution where superstitions thrive. In theatrical tradition, a black cat in the theatre is considered extraordinarily lucky, its presence ensuring a successful production and protecting performers from accidents. The origin of this belief is unclear, but it persisted even during the height of witch panic, suggesting that certain professional communities developed their own folklore independent of broader social fears. Actors would go out of their way to attract black cats to their theatres, feeding them and providing shelter, believing their departure would bring disaster to upcoming shows. Victorian literature solidified and spread the black cat superstition to wider audiences. Authors like Edgar Allan Poe used black cats as symbols of doom and supernatural evil. Their stories read throughout the English-speaking world and beyond. Poe's story, The Black Cat, features a creature that becomes increasingly malevolent, haunting its owner and ultimately leading to his destruction. The tale, published in 1843, reinforced every negative association while adding new layers of psychological horror. Other writers followed suit, embedding black cats into Gothic literature as standard elements of supernatural dread. These fictional depictions fed back into popular belief, making the superstition seem validated by culture and literature, rather than merely folk tradition. Yet even as literature reinforced negative associations, everyday British life showed more nuanced attitudes. Working-class families often kept cats regardless of colour, valuing them for pest control and companionship. The superstition was strongest among those who had leisure to worry about omens. Those whose lives were stable enough that they could afford to believe in supernatural causes for misfortune. For people struggling with poverty, disease, and the daily challenges of survival, a cat was simply a cat, useful or not, depending on its hunting ability. The superstition thrived in the middle and upper classes, spreading through literature and parlour conversation, while existing less firmly among those who live closer to practical necessity. The legacy of the path-crossing superstition persists in modern Britain, though its intensity has diminished considerably. Most people today treat it as quaint folklore rather than serious belief, a cultural artifact maintained more from tradition than conviction. Yet surveys consistently show that significant minorities still report feeling uneasy when a black cat crosses their path, suggesting that centuries of conditioning have left traces in collective consciousness. The superstition has become detached from its origins in witch persecution, transformed into a general omen divorced from the specific horror that created it. People who would never believe in witches still hesitate when a black cat moves across their trajectory, demonstrating how beliefs can outlive the context that gave them meaning. Journey north now, across the border that separates England from Scotland, and witness something remarkable. Cross this line, this political boundary drawn by centuries of conflict and separate governance, and the black cat transforms. The same creature that English folklore painted as demonic becomes, in Scottish tradition, a harbinger of prosperity, protection, and good fortune. This is not a subtle difference or a minor variation in interpretation. It is a complete reversal, a mirror image belief system, where everything associated with doom south of the border signifies blessing to the north. Understanding why Scotland developed such radically different folklore about black cats reveals how culture, history, and pre-Christian traditions shaped beliefs in ways that official church doctrine could not entirely suppress. Scottish folklore treated the appearance of a black cat on your doorstep as one of the most fortunate omens imaginable. If you woke to find a black cat sitting at your door, you could expect prosperity to enter your household soon. It might manifest as unexpected income, a successful harvest, a profitable business transaction, or simply the general improvement of your family's circumstances. The cat was not seen as a threat or a familiar spirit serving darker purposes. It was understood as a messenger, a living embodiment of luck, choosing to favor your home with its presence. Householders who found black cats at their doors would welcome them, feed them, and sometimes keep them permanently, believing that driving away such fortune would be catastrophic folly. Weddings represented another crucial context where Scottish attitudes diverged dramatically from English beliefs. If a black cat appeared at a Scottish wedding, particularly if it approached the bride, this was considered the most auspicious sign possible. The marriage would be blessed with happiness, prosperity, and fertility. Couples would sometimes arrange for black cats to attend their ceremonies deliberately, having friends bring cats to ensure the blessing. This practice existed even during periods when witch trials were active in Scotland, demonstrating that folk belief could operate independently of official religious doctrine. The people maintained two separate frameworks, acknowledging the church's concerns about witchcraft, while simultaneously preserving older traditions that predated Christianity's arrival. The origins of this positive Scottish association likely trace back to Celtic traditions that survived Christianization more robustly in Scotland than in England. Celtic cultures, which dominated Scotland before and during the Roman period, had complex relationships with animals that often differed from later Christian interpretations. The Kate Sith, or fairy cat, appeared in Highlands folklore as a creature of the otherworld, neither good nor evil but powerful and deserving of respect. This fairy cat was described as enormous, black with a white spot on its chest, and capable of bringing either blessing or curse, depending on how it was treated. The key difference from Christian demonology was that the Kate Sith's favour could be earned through proper respect and offerings, rather than being inherently demonic and beyond redemption. Scottish sailors developed particularly strong positive associations with black cats, beliefs so entrenched that they created actual economic value for the animals. Ship captains considered a black cat essential crew, its presence believed to ensure safe passage, favourable winds, and protection from storms. Sailors' wives kept black cats at home, believing they would mystically protect their husbands at sea and ensure their safe return. This belief was so strong that black cats near port towns were frequently stolen by sailors preparing for voyages, their value as luck bringers outweighing concerns about theft. Some fishing families bred black cats specifically for this purpose, selling them to ship captains for substantial sums. The cats lived aboard ships, often pampered by crews who credited them with surviving storms or avoiding disasters. The fishing village tradition extended beyond mere superstition into practical community insurance. If a sailor died at sea, his widow faced potential destitution, but if she owned a black cat, she could sell or rent it to other sailors, providing income that might mean the difference between survival and starvation. Black cats thus became economic assets, their perceived luck-bringing abilities translated into real material value. Widows guarded their black cats carefully, understanding that these animals represented security in a profession where death was common and families were left vulnerable. This economic dimension reinforced the positive associations, creating a feedback loop where belief generated value that strengthened belief. Geographical isolation played a role in preserving these divergent beliefs. The Scottish Highlands remained less connected to English cultural centres, maintaining traditions that elsewhere had been suppressed or transformed. Highland communities spoke Gaelic rather than English, limiting the spread of English folklore and written materials that reinforce negative cat associations. The clan system, which persisted longer in Scotland than feudalism did in England, created strong local identities that resisted outside influence. When authorities tried to impose uniform beliefs about witchcraft and cats, Highland communities often ignored them or gave superficial compliance while maintaining their actual practices in private. The rough terrain and political independence of Scotland made enforcement of religious orthodoxy more difficult than in more centralised England. Even during Scotland's own witch trials, which were extensive and brutal, the treatment of cats showed interesting variations. While Scottish witch hunters did sometimes cite cats as familiars and evidence of witchcraft, the accusations focused more on specific instances of harm rather than the general principle that cat ownership indicated demonic alliance. A witch might be accused of sending her cat to sicken a neighbour's livestock, but simply owning a black cat was less automatically damning than in England. The distinction was subtle but significant, suggesting that underlying positive cultural associations with cats tempered even the worst excesses of witch panic. Prosecutors needed to prove specific malevolent actions rather than relying solely on the animal's presence as evidence. The contradiction between Scottish and English beliefs about black cats demonstrates a fundamental truth about superstitions. They are not universal human responses to phenomena, but culturally constructed interpretations that vary based on history, tradition, and local circumstances. The same black cat, the same animal with the same behaviors and characteristics, became symbols of opposite concepts depending entirely on which side of a political border you stood. This should give us pause when considering any cultural belief that presents itself as obvious or natural. What seems self-evident in one context may be reversed just miles away, revealing that our certainties are often accidents of geography and historical circumstance, rather than fundamental truths about reality. Scotland kept its cats, valued them, protected them, and prospered from the relationship, proving that alternative interpretations were always possible, even when most of Europe had chosen a darker path. Travel east now, across continents and oceans, to a civilization that looked at cats and saw not demons but divine messengers, not familiars of witches, but guardians against evil. While Europe burned its cats and condemned millions to death for the crime of nocturnal habits, Japan was developing a relationship with these creatures that was almost the exact inverse of Western belief. The black cat, that symbol of terror in Christian lands, became in Japanese culture a creature of protection, prosperity, and spiritual power. To understand this fundamental divergence, to grasp how the same animal could carry such opposite meanings, we must immerse ourselves in Japanese philosophy, Buddhist teachings, and the unique folklore that shaped attitudes toward the natural world. Japanese culture, influenced heavily by Buddhism and Shintoism, approached animals with a fundamentally different framework than Christian Europe. Shinto belief held that kami, spirits, or divine essences, could inhabit natural objects and living creatures. Animals were not inferior beings created for human use, but entities with their own spiritual significance, deserving respect and capable of bringing blessing or harm depending on how they were treated. Buddhism added layers of complexity, teaching that all living beings possessed Buddha and that kindness to animals generated positive karma. Within this philosophical context, cats were never candidates for demonization. They were recognized as hunters, companions, and creatures with their own mysterious intelligence that suggested deeper spiritual dimensions. The Maneki-neko, the beckoning cat, stands as the most visible symbol of Japanese cat reverence. You have seen these figures, even if you did not know their name or significance. Small ceramic or plastic cats, usually white but sometimes black, sitting upright with one paw raised in a beckoning gesture, placed in shop windows, restaurants, and homes throughout Japan and increasingly across the world. The raised paw invites fortune, prosperity, and customers. The higher the paw is raised, the greater the fortune it can attract. Some Maneki-neko hold coins, reinforcing their association with wealth. Others wear bibs and bells, elements that connect them to Buddhist imagery and protective talismans. These are not mere decorations, but active spiritual tools, believed to genuinely influence fortune and protect against misfortune. The legend behind the Maneki-neko traces to various origin stories, but the most famous involves the Gotokuji temple in Tokyo during the early Edo period, around the 17th century. A priest at this poor temple kept a cat, despite barely having enough food for himself. One day, a wealthy lord passing by the temple took shelter under a tree during a rainstorm. He noticed a cat sitting at the temple gate, seemingly beckoning him. Curious, he approached, and at that moment, lightning struck the tree where he had been standing. The cat had saved his life. The grateful lord became a patron of the temple, ensuring its prosperity. When the cat died, it was honored with a special grave and memorial, and its image was replicated as a talisman to invite good fortune. The tradition spread, and Maneki-neko became ubiquitous symbols of luck throughout Japan. Black cats held particular significance within Japanese folklore. Their dark fur associated with warding off evil spirits and negative energy. Unlike Western associations of black with death and evil, Japanese tradition viewed black as absorbing and neutralizing malevolent forces. A black cat in the home acted as a spiritual shield, protecting residents from yokai, malicious spirits, and bad luck. Women in particular were encouraged to keep black cats, as they were believed to ward off unwanted romantic attention and protect against stalkers, a belief that persists in modified form even today. The Edo period saw black cats become fashionable among courtesans and geisha, who valued them both for protection and as status symbols. Ship cats in Japan, as in Scotland, were considered essential for successful voyages, but the Japanese reasoning differed slightly. While Scottish sailors focused on storm protection and safe return, Japanese maritime tradition emphasized the cat's ability to detect weather changes and spiritual disturbances. Sailors believed cats could sense approaching typhoons before instruments or human observation could detect them, their restless behavior providing early warning to seek shelter. Black cats were particularly valued for this sensitivity, their connection to spiritual realms supposedly making them more attuned to invisible dangers. Fishing fleets would compete to acquire black cats, and families would breed them specifically for sale to maritime ventures. The contrast with European beliefs becomes most stark when examining how Japanese culture responded to illness and misfortune in contexts involving cats. When plague or disease struck a community, European authorities would often intensify cat persecution, viewing the animals as either causes or symbols of divine punishment. Japanese responses moved in the opposite direction. During epidemics, people would acquire cats or increase their care for existing ones, believing the animals could absorb and dispel the spiritual pollution associated with disease. Temples kept cats specifically for this purpose, and sick people would sometimes sleep near cats in the belief that the animals would draw illness from the body. This approach, while not medically accurate, at least did not worsen the ecological balance or eliminate natural pest control during crisis periods. Japanese art immortalized cats in ways that revealed cultural attitudes toward them. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints from the Edo period frequently featured cats, often in domestic scenes, that emphasized their role as beloved companions. Artists like Utagawa Kuniyoshi created entire series devoted to cats, showing them in human poses, engaged in human activities, treated with affection and humor rather than fear. Black cats appeared regularly in these works, depicted as elegant, mysterious, and attractive rather than sinister. The artistic tradition both reflected and reinforced positive cultural associations, creating a feedback loop where art celebrated cats, and popular appreciation of that art strengthened positive attitudes toward the animals themselves. Buddhist temples maintained complex relationships with cats that further embedded them in spiritual life. Many temples kept cats to protect sacred texts and food stores from rodents, but the relationship transcended mere utility. Cats were seen as meditation companions, their stillness and focused attention serving as examples of proper contemplative practice. Some Buddhist teachings used cats as symbols of non-attachment, noting how they move through the world independent and self-sufficient, neither clinging to nor rejecting experiences. Monks would feed temple cats as an act of merit-making, generating positive karma through kindness to living beings. When temple cats died, they received proper funeral rites and were sometimes buried in temple grounds, their graves marked and maintained. The economic dimension of Japanese cat appreciation created markets that incentivized breeding and care rather than persecution. Black cats commanded premium prices for various purposes, as ship companions, as protective household guardians, as gifts that conveyed wishes for prosperity and protection. Breeders specialized in producing cats with particular characteristics, and markets existed where quality animals could be purchased for significant sums. This economic value meant that even people who did not share traditional beliefs about spiritual protection had practical reasons to value cats. The animals generated income, served practical purposes, and carried social prestige. Every incentive aligned toward protecting and increasing cat populations rather than destroying them. Modern Japan has maintained and even intensified its positive relationship with cats. Cat cafes, where customers pay to spend time with cats in comfortable settings, originated in Japan and spread globally. The country celebrates numerous cat-themed festivals, maintains cat islands where felines outnumber humans, and produces endless cat-themed merchandise. Black cats remain particularly popular, seen as stylish and elegant rather than unlucky. Japanese popular culture, from Hello Kitty to Studio Ghibli films, consistently portrays cats as positive figures worthy of affection and respect. This continuity from ancient tradition to modern practice demonstrates how cultural attitudes, once established, can persist and evolve while maintaining core positive associations. Japan looked at cats and chose reverence over fear, protection over persecution, and in doing so, created a relationship that benefited both species across centuries. Something remarkable happened in the 20th century, a transformation so complete that it would have been unimaginable to those who watched cats burn in medieval pyres. The black cat, symbol of evil for centuries, creature condemned by popes and executed by the thousands, began its journey from demon to icon. This reversal did not happen overnight or uniformly. It emerged gradually through changing cultural attitudes, scientific understanding, and the peculiar way that distance from horror allows us to transform terror into entertainment. Today, black cats are Halloween mascots, internet celebrities, and subjects of affectionate memes. Yet beneath this cheerful reclamation, disturbing remnants of ancient prejudice persist, revealing that cultural transformation is never as complete as we might hope. The rehabilitation of the black cat began, ironically, with the holiday most associated with their persecution. Halloween, originally the Celtic festival of Samhain, marking the boundary between summer and winter, between the living and the dead, evolved in America during the late 19th and early 20th centuries into a commercialized celebration of the spooky and supernatural. Marketing companies seeking symbols that would sell cards, decorations, and costumes seized upon black cats as perfect embodiments of Halloween atmosphere. But the cat on these decorations was no longer terrifying. It was cartoonish, stylized, often cute rather than frightening. Arched back, raised fur, wide eyes. These images transformed the animal from object of genuine fear into aesthetic shorthand for playful scariness. The commodification of Halloween neutered the black cat's symbolic power, making it safe, consumable, nostalgic rather than threatening. Scientific advancement played a crucial role in undermining superstitions about cats. The discovery of germ theory in the 19th century, the development of epidemiology, the understanding of disease vectors, all these revealed that plague and illness had natural rather than supernatural causes. Educated people in the 20th century could no longer seriously believe that cats were demonic familiars, or that witches transformed into felines. The mechanisms of reality had been exposed, and they involved bacteria, viruses, and parasites rather than curses and shape-shifting. This knowledge filtered slowly through society, taking generations to fully displace older beliefs, but its effect was inexorable. Superstitions that had seemed self-evident to earlier generations became quaint folklore, stories grandparents told, rather than truths anyone actually believed. The internet age accelerated black cat rehabilitation in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras. Social media platforms became stages where cats of all colors achieved celebrity status, their images shared millions of times, their antics celebrated by global audiences. Black cats proved particularly photogenic in this digital context, their dark fur creating dramatic contrast in photographs, their eyes luminous and expressive against ebony backgrounds. Accounts dedicated to specific black cats accumulated hundreds of thousands of followers. Videos of black cats playing, sleeping, or simply existing garnered millions of views. The cumulative effect was normalization through exposure. When you see black cats portrayed as beloved companions daily in your social media feeds, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain ancient prejudices about their supposedly demonic. Animal welfare organizations recognize the marketing potential of the internet and social media, using these platforms to advocate for black cat adoption. They created campaigns highlighting the beauty and personality of black cats, countering persistent myths about bad luck and difficult adoption prospects. Organizations like the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals launched specific initiatives during October, Black Cat Awareness Month, using Halloween's association with black cats to increase visibility rather than perpetuate fear. These campaigns featured professional photography showcasing black cats in the best possible light, testimonials from satisfied adopters, and statistical information debunking myths. The approach was deliberate cultural engineering, using modern communication tools to reshape attitudes that had persisted for centuries. Yet, despite these efforts, adoption statistics reveal that old prejudices have not entirely disappeared. Black cats consistently take longer to adopt from shelters than cats of other colors, a phenomenon so well documented that animal welfare professionals have given it a name: black cat syndrome. Multiple factors contribute to this disparity. Some adopters admit they avoid black cats because of lingering superstitious associations, conscious or unconscious discomfort with cultural narratives they may not even consciously believe. Others cite practical concerns, noting that black cats are harder to photograph well for social media, an absurd but genuine consideration in an age where pet ownership is often performed publicly, online. Still, others simply find black cats less visually distinctive, preferring cats with unusual markings or color patterns that make them seem more unique. The Halloween season, despite its role in normalizing black cat imagery, actually creates annual danger for the animals. October sees a spike in cruelty cases involving black cats, ranging from pranks to serious abuse to outright killing. Some shelters respond by refusing to adopt out black cats during the weeks surrounding Halloween, a policy that protects animals but also reduces their chances of finding homes during high-traffic adoption periods. The motivation behind Halloween-related cat abuse varies. Some cases involve misguided attempts at holiday pranks by people who see black cats as props rather than living beings. Others reflect deliberate cruelty by individuals who claim occult interests and seek black cats for supposed rituals. Still others result from pure malice, people harming animals simply because cultural associations make black cats seem like appropriate victims. Popular culture now treats black cats with more nuance than medieval demons or Victorian omens, but representations remain mixed. Children's books and animated films increasingly portray black cats as heroes, wise companions, or comic relief rather than villains. Characters like Gigi from Studio Ghibli's Kiki's Delivery Service, or Binks from Hocus Pocus, present black cats as loyal, brave, and fundamentally good. Yet horror films and Halloween marketing still exploit traditional associations, using black cats as atmospheric elements that signal danger or supernatural presence. The dual representation reflects broader cultural confusion about what black cats mean, caught between centuries of negative symbolism and modern attempts at reclamation. Social justice movements within animal welfare have begun explicitly addressing the racism inherent in color-based discrimination against cats. Activists note parallels between human colorism and black cat syndrome, arguing that rejecting black cats because of their appearance reflects the same psychological biases that devalue darker skin in human contexts. This framing, controversial in some circles, has gained traction, particularly among younger animal advocates who see connections between various forms of prejudice. Campaigns now explicitly celebrate black beauty in feline form, using language and imagery that deliberately evokes civil rights rhetoric. Whether this approach proves effective remains to be seen, but it represents recognition that animal prejudices do not exist in isolation from human biases. The transformation of black cats from demons to internet stars is incomplete, contradictory, and ongoing. We live in a transitional moment where ancient superstitions coexist with modern celebration, where black cats can be both Halloween mascots and victims of Halloween cruelty. where they dominate social media feeds yet languish longest in shelter cages. This contradiction reveals something fundamental about cultural change. It is never clean or total. Old beliefs do not simply disappear when proven false. They persist in modified forms, shaping behavior and attitudes even among people who consciously reject their validity. The black cat's curse is fading, but not gone. Transformed from explicit demonization into subtle discrimination, from burning pyres to adoption delays, from religious persecution to aesthetic preference. Progress has occurred, undeniably. But the journey from devil's familiar to beloved companion remains unfinished. Every autumn, as October arrives and Halloween decorations appear in store windows, animal shelters across the United States, Canada, and Britain implement a policy that seems counterintuitive to their mission. They stop adopting out black cats. During the busiest adoption season of the year, when foot traffic increases and public interest peaks, shelters deliberately withhold their most vulnerable animals from potential homes. This policy, controversial within animal welfare communities, emerges not from superstition or tradition, but from hard experience with genuine cruelty. The weeks surrounding Halloween see a documented spike in abuse cases involving black cats, attacks that range from pranks to serious injury to outright killing. Behind this policy lies a dark reality that reveals how ancient prejudices continue to manifest in modern violence. The statistics paint a disturbing picture. Animal control agencies report that black cat intake increases significantly in late October and early November. Animals found injured, traumatized, or dead in ways that suggest deliberate harm rather than accidents or natural causes. Some are discovered with injuries consistent with being thrown or kicked. Others show signs of being used in attempts at ritualistic activity, though whether these attempts reflect genuine occult practice or teenagers playing at darkness remains unclear. Still others are found with evidence of prolonged abuse, suggesting they were taken specifically for the purpose of causing suffering. The numbers vary by region and year, but the pattern is consistent enough that shelters have developed specific protocols for managing black cat populations during the Halloween season. Consider the case documented in Massachusetts during 2015, when animal control responded to reports of cats being harmed in a series of coordinated attacks. Over a 3-week period surrounding Halloween, 7 black cats were found seriously injured in a specific neighborhood. The animals had been beaten, some set on fire, others showing signs of torture that authorities declined to describe in detail to spare public sensibilities. Investigation revealed a group of teenagers who had formed what they called a coven, using social media to coordinate their activities and document their crimes. They had specifically targeted black cats because of Halloween associations, believing this made their actions more transgressive and authentic. All 7 cats required extensive veterinary care. 2 did not survive, and the perpetrators faced animal cruelty charges that resulted in probation and community service. Sentences that animal advocates considered inadequate, given the deliberate, sustained of the abuse. Shelter staff describe the difficult position Halloween creates for them. Their mission is to place animals in loving homes, to maximize adoptions and reduce shelter populations. Yet they also bear responsibility for protecting animals from foreseeable harm. When October arrives, they must decide whether the risk of abuse outweighs the opportunity for adoption. Many shelters implement total black cat adoption bans during the final 2 weeks of October. Others conduct enhanced screening, requiring references, home checks, and adoption fees that are non-refundable, even if the adoption fails. Some restrict adoptions only to people who have previously adopted from their facility successfully. These measures reduce risk, but also reduce adoptions, creating a cruel irony. where Halloween simultaneously increases public awareness of black cats, while making it harder for those cats to find homes. The debate within animal welfare circles about Halloween adoption bans reveals philosophical divides about risk management and mission priorities. Opponents of bans argue that they are based on fear rather than data, that the actual percentage of Halloween adopted cats who suffer abuse is statistically small, that the policy prevents hundreds of legitimate adoptions to prevent a handful of tragedies. They point out that people who intend harm can acquire cats through other means, can lie during screening, can wait until November to adopt. The bans, they argue, are security theatre that makes shelters feel protective while actually harming animals by extending their shelter stays and reducing overall adoption numbers. The policy assumes the worst about human and punishes responsible potential adopters for crimes others might commit. Proponents of bans counter that even one case of preventable abuse justifies protective measures, that shelters have learned through painful experience that Halloween creates real danger, that their responsibility includes protecting animals from foreseeable harm, even when this conflicts with placement goals. They describe cases where adopters seemed legitimate during screening, but were later discovered to have adopted cats for harmful purposes. They note that the temporary of the restriction, usually 2 to 3 weeks, is not an unreasonable ask for genuine adopters who can simply return after Halloween. They argue that the criticism, while well-intentioned, comes from people who have not personally dealt with recovering animals from Halloween-related abuse, or notifying families that pets they surrendered to shelters were subsequently harmed. The reality of Halloween abuse extends beyond isolated incidents to include organised attempts at using black cats in occult rituals. While most modern practitioners of Wicca, neo-paganism, and other alternative spiritualities explicitly oppose animal harm and would never involve animals in their practices, fringe elements and teenage experimenters sometimes seek black cats, believing them necessary for specific rituals. Law enforcement occasionally encounters cases where individuals admit to acquiring black cats for use in ceremonies meant to summon demons, cast curses, or gain supernatural power. These cases, while relatively rare, are genuine and documented. Animal control has recovered cats from makeshift altars, sometimes alive and traumatized, sometimes dead, surrounded by candles, symbols, and paraphernalia, suggesting attempted ritual use. The perpetrators range from mentally ill individuals to curious teenagers, to people genuinely attempting occult practice. Social media has complicated the Halloween danger by creating audiences for cruelty. Some abuse cases now involve perpetrators who film their actions and post them online, seeking attention, shock value, or validation from like-minded individuals. The performative aspect of these crimes suggests that the motivation is not a cult belief, but rather the desire for notoriety in online spaces that celebrate transgression. Black cats become props in content designed to provoke reaction. Their suffering documented and shared for entertainment. Platforms struggle to remove this content quickly enough to prevent its spread, and perpetrators often face minimal consequences unless their actions rise to the level that triggers criminal investigation. The economic impact of Halloween policies affects shelter operations and animal outcomes. Adoption fees represent significant revenue for shelters operating on tight budgets. Blocking black cat adoptions for weeks during high traffic periods means substantial lost income that could have funded veterinary care, facility improvements, or extended hours. Some shelters compromise by increasing adoption fees for black cats during October, attempting to deter impulsive or ill-intentioned adopters, while still allowing serious candidates to proceed. Others partner with rescue organizations that conduct more intensive screening, transferring black cats temporarily to groups that can provide closer monitoring of adoptions. These solutions attempt to balance protection with mission, though none is perfect. The persistence of Halloween danger for black cats demonstrates how thoroughly ancient superstitions have embedded themselves in culture. People who would never consciously believe in witches or familiars still treat black cats as appropriate subjects for Halloween-themed violence. The association between black cats and Halloween, initially created by persecution and later commercialized into decoration, has become so ingrained that it enables cruelty by providing cultural justification. The animals suffer not because individuals believe they are demonic, but because centuries of cultural conditioning have made them symbols, objects, props in human narratives about darkness and transgression. Every autumn, shelters become guardians against this conditioning, protecting creatures who cannot protect themselves from prejudices they did nothing to create and violence they do not deserve. We have journeyed together through centuries of darkness and light, traced the path of the black cat from Egyptian temples to medieval pyres, from witch trial courtrooms to modern shelter cages. We have witnessed reverence transform into terror, watched millions die for superstitions that had no basis in reality, seen how fear combined with institutional power creates catastrophe that echoes across generations. Now, as our journey concludes, we must ask the essential question that gives all this history meaning. What does the story of the black cat teach us about ourselves, about human, about the choices we make when faced with the unknown and the different? The answer is uncomfortable, necessary, and profoundly relevant to challenges we face today. The black cat's curse was never about the cats themselves. These animals did not change across the centuries we have examined. They remained what they had always been: independent hunters, nocturnal creatures, companions to those who valued them, and mysteries to those who did not understand them. The curse existed entirely in human perception, in our capacity to project meaning onto innocent beings, to transform the neutral into the threatening through nothing more than cultural narrative and institutional decree. When Pope Gregory declared cats demonic, he did not reveal truth about animals. He created reality through authority, demonstrating how power shapes perception and how perception, once shaped, resists correction even in the face of catastrophic consequences. Consider what happened when superstition gained the force of law and the backing of the world's most powerful institution. Millions of animals died horrible deaths. Communities turned against neighbors, using cat ownership as pretext for settling grudges or eliminating inconvenient people. The ecological balance of an entire continent was disrupted, creating conditions that enabled plague to kill tens of millions. All of this flowed from a single decision to label certain creatures as evil, to give fear the power of policy, to replace observation and reason with certainty and zealotry. The lesson is clear and terrifying. When we allow prejudice to become policy, when we give institutional power to superstition, the consequences are never limited to the initial targets. They metastasize, spreading harm in ways we cannot predict and often cannot contain. The geographic divergence in beliefs about black cats reveals another crucial truth. Scotland and Japan developed positive relationships with the same animals that Europe condemned, proving that alternative interpretations were always possible. The Scottish sailor who treasured his black cat for protection and the European witch hunter who saw the same animal as demonic were responding to cultural conditioning rather than objective reality. Neither was more correct about the cat's inherent, because cats do not possess inherent symbolic meaning. We create that meaning, project it outward, and then treat our projections as discoveries. Recognizing this process, seeing how arbitrary our certainties often are, might make us more humble about declaring what is obviously true and more willing to examine whether our convictions reflect reality or merely inherited prejudice. The story of black cat persecution also demonstrates how institutions resist admitting error, even when consequences become undeniable. As rat populations exploded and plague devastated Europe, the Church did not reverse its position on cats or acknowledge that its policies had contributed to disaster. Instead, it doubled down, intensified witch prosecutions, blamed human sin for divine punishment, did everything except admit that its war on cats had been a catastrophic mistake. This pattern, refusing to acknowledge institutional error even when evidence overwhelms initial justification, appears throughout history and remains relevant today. We see it in organizations that cannot admit they were wrong, in movements that interpret failure as proof they did not go far enough, in systems that protect themselves at the expense of those they claim to serve. Yet the story also offers hope, evidence that cultural transformation is possible even when prejudices seem immovably entrenched. Black cats survived their persecution, populations recovered, attitudes shifted, slowly and incompletely, but shifted nonetheless. Modern campaigns to increase black cat adoption demonstrate that targeted effort can reshape cultural narratives, that education and exposure can undermine even ancient biases. The transformation is not complete. Black cat syndrome persists. Halloween still brings danger, but progress has occurred. This suggests that other entrenched prejudices, other cultural certainties that cause harm, might also be challenged and changed through sustained effort and willingness to question inherited assumptions. The persistence of Halloween-related abuse, the continued slower adoption rates for black cats, the lingering discomfort some people feel encountering these animals, all reveal how thoroughly superstitions embed themselves in collective consciousness. Beliefs do not disappear simply because we prove them false or demonstrate their harmful consequences. They persist as unconscious biases, aesthetic preferences, unexamined assumptions that shape behavior even among people who consciously reject the original justification. This is why cultural change requires sustained effort across generations, why education alone is insufficient, why we must actively work to identify and challenge conditioning that operates below the level of conscious awareness. The black cat stands as a mirror, reflecting back to us our own capacity for both wisdom and madness, compassion and cruelty, reason and superstition. When we look at these creatures and see demons, we reveal something about ourselves rather than about them. When we overcome conditioning to see them as they actually are, complex living beings deserving of respect and protection, we demonstrate our capacity for growth and change. The choice between these perspectives remains ours every day, in contexts far beyond our treatment of cats. Do we see the other, whether human or animal, through the lens of inherited prejudice, or do we make the effort to see clearly, to question what we have been taught, to judge based on observation rather than assumption? As we conclude this journey through darkness and into gradual light, I want to invite you to continue exploring these themes with us here at Echoes of the Old World. We delve into forgotten histories, examine the myths that shape civilizations, and ask uncomfortable questions about what the past reveals about human. If this story has moved you, challenged you, or made you think differently about prejudice and certainty, subscribe now and join our community of seekers who believe that understanding history is essential to building a better future. Together, we can learn from the past and choose different paths forward. The shadow at the threshold that we encountered at the beginning of this journey was never cast by the black cat. It was our shadow, the darkness we carry within ourselves, our capacity for creating monsters from innocent beings when fear and certainty override compassion and reason. Every black cat that crosses your path offers a choice. Will you see an animal, a fellow creature navigating its existence as best it can? Or will you see an omen, a symbol, a projection of cultural fears that have nothing to do with the being before you? That choice multiplied across millions of encounters and extended to all situations where we confront difference and mystery, determines what kind of world we create. The curse we must break is not the cat's. It never was. The curse is our own willingness to believe in curses, to see evil where none exists, to choose fear over understanding. Break that curse, and we might finally see clearly what has been before us all along. Not demons, or familiars, or omens, but living beings sharing this world with us, deserving of respect, protection, and the chance to exist without bearing the weight of our projected fears. That is the lesson. That is the truth. That is what the black cat has been trying to teach us for centuries, waiting patiently in the shadows for us to finally understand.